The Discontented Ghost, Chapter 3. Now that the matter of Lady Eleanor has come up, and my own sudden disappearance under very mysterious circumstances, I suppose this is as good a time as any to make a clean breast of the actual facts, even though some of them fill me with shame. I feel I must force myself to disclose them, since here is one of the places where Oscar really shot wide of the mark. Of course, one cannot blame him. He only knew what had been reported. He did quote me accurately, however, as to a statement I once had occasion to make about Lady Eleanor. My wife was very plain, never had my ruffs properly starched, and knew nothing about cookery. Why, there was a buck I had shot in Hogley Woods, a magnificent pricket, and do you know how she had it sent up to the table? She was then 28, and I a year older. We had been married for 8 years. Everything in my statement was justified except for the slight exaggeration as to her plainness, which I threw in for an effect at that time. She was plain, yes, but not very plain. By your standards today, with her long, straight, sleek black hair, her high cheekbones, and her unusual greenish-gray eyes, she might even be judged not bad-looking at all, especially considering her really superb figure. But all the rest of my statement toed the mark. Speaking of that pricket, as far as her demise was concerned, it was that very pricket that brought about the happy event that provided me the best 9 years of my life. Having bagged the creature, I invited to dinner a large group of friends and enemies. In those days, it was hard to tell which were which, as you must know if you have read your Shakespeare. I confidently expected that evening to be one of the great social triumphs of my life. I looked forward to observing with insolent eyes the ill-concealed envy of Sir Mordred Montague, with whom I had long feuded over faggot-gathering rights to a forest in which our property lines met, and the jealous spleen of Lord Braceley of Braceley Hall, who disputed order of precedence with me every time we entered mutual friends' dining halls. Great would be their mortification and dark their thoughts when they saw the pricket supreme I had planned to set before them that night. You can scarcely conceive, then, of my confusion and embarrassment when I saw what Lady Eleanor had caused to be done with the main course. My triumph was ashes in my mouth, and compared to the rest of the food, the ashes tasted good. The guests coped by simply getting even drunker than usual. I thought they would never leave. When at long last the final guest had been carried out and sent on his way, I flew into a passion and sent a servant with kicks and blows to summon Lady Eleanor to the library. Standing in front of the fireplace, feet planted well apart, hands clenched behind my back, I glanced up at the portrait of good Sir Alfred, who still had his place of honor in those days, and drew grim resolve from his fiery scowl. When Lady Eleanor appeared, her habitual taunting and supercilious smile was on her face. That was what our marriage had come to by then, smiles of that description whenever we were tete-a-tete. And, as usual, she was knitting away on something 60 to the minute. Oh, how I hated the click of those long, slim, steel knitting needles. Number 25 they were, I have since learned. In recent years I have taken up a bit of knitting now and then myself, and find it very relaxing. But in those days, because of her, I detested every form of such handiwork. For one thing, she never found time to knit a pair of mittens for me, or anything like that. Oh no, it was always scarves for the servants or the village needy. She made a deep mocking curtsy and said, "Well, my lord, what is it now?" "Thou knowest full well what it is," I retorted hotly. I was never so humiliated. That buck! "I loved that buck," she murmured. "He had thy teeth." "Quip me no quips," I roared. "That buck was overcooked. King Henry himself couldn't have eaten it. But that wasn't the worst of it. Whatever possessed thee to have it sent to the table whole with an apple in its mouth?" She batted her eyelids in simulated innocence. "Is that not the standard recipe, my lord?" "No, no, thou fool. 'Tis boars that have apples in their mouths." She turned, took an apple from a bowl, and handed it to me. "Prithee put one in thy mouth, so I may see how a boar looketh." I hurled the apple into the fireplace. Not that kind of boar saucepot. B-O-A-R, with bristles. Thou hast bristles, she pointed out, right on the end of thy wart. There was no abiding the virago. From a collection of arms arranged on the mantelpiece, I seized a Florentine stiletto, complete with bejeweled handle and scabbard, which I had once picked up in a little shop on the Ponte Vecchio. Another just like that, I cried, and it will be your last. Her laughter trilled out, but then the blackness of my brow proved enough even to alarm her, and she whirled around to hurry away. As she did so, her foot caught in a ragged rent in the great Hamadan carpet an ancestor on my grandmother's side had brought back from the Crusades. If I had told her once, I had told her 100 times to have Tom the weaver come in and fix that rip. She tumbled forward, fell heavily on her face, uttered a piercing cry, and rolled slowly on her back. A pierced cry, I should have said. One of her number 2 knitting needles was sticking straight up from her shapely bosom. Her eyes were opened in a fixed stare of horror that quickly turned glassy. I knelt beside her and pressed my head against her breast, listening for heartbeats. All I accomplished, however, was to get a good deal of blood on my ear. She was dead. I was in a panic. You can understand my position. The servants had surely heard our quarrel. They were always hanging around, listening behind doors. What would they think? What would be left of the family honor? Were even one of them to blunder in and observe what had happened before I had a chance to stop him? If ever it got around that my clumsy clod of a wife had died by falling on her own knitting needle, we Cantervilles would never live it down. We would be the laughing stock of every shire. Noble women simply did not die in such lower-class ways. Look at Shakespeare's plays. Look at Webster's. With a woman of breeding, it had to be a high tragedy, a melodramatic suicide, or a classy murder, preferably at the hands of somebody equally impeccable social standing. But instead, she had left me with this scandal on my hands. It was just like her. What was I to do now? How? The stiletto. Suddenly, I was aware that the Florentine stiletto was still in my hand. I examined its exquisitely worked handle, its dazzling scabbard. Yes, it was worthy. I would have paid at least 20 ducats for it, if I had paid for it. I drew the thin blade from its scabbard and found it to be perfect. A number 2 size stiletto, if I had ever seen one. Carefully, I drew the knitting needle from Lady Eleanor's breast and replaced it with a stiletto. A slightly tight fit, perhaps, but a few smart taps drove it home. I had wiped the needle clean and hidden it in my doublet and was tidying up my ear by the time the first servant summoned up enough courage to enter the room and quaver, "Bibi, they aught amiss, my lord?" Well, there was a great to-do about the matter, of course, but I went scot-free. I had known I would. All I had to do was call as witnesses several of the noblemen who had been among the guests that evening when the pricket was sent to the table. In fact, the local magistrate, Sir Gawain Glutworthy, had been among the guests and had suffered from indigestion all night long after forcing down his helpings of the buck. A verdict of justifiable uxoricide was speedily returned, and I went home. From that moment forward, my life was utterly changed. When a man is thought to have murdered his wife, it gives him a certain panache he would not otherwise have. I became a popular figure. I was asked to dinner oftener than ever before. In truth, I dined out on the story for at least a year. And naturally, as time went on, I improved the story, until I almost grew to believe it myself. Safe from any threat of disclosure of my true shame, I went on living a lie, with ruthless pleasure, and with scarcely a twinge of conscience. For one thing, I never again appeared in company anywhere without the famous stiletto at my side. Needless to say, everyone wanted to see it. You should have heard the ladies ooh and ah over it. Speaking of the ladies, my new luster proved invaluable to me in that department. Where once they had avoided my eyes with a yawn or even a slight shudder, They still shuddered, but in a different way. Deliciously, you might say. Yes, indeed, many a sparkling glance was cast Sir Simon Ward now. A dangerous lover has a great appeal to women. Dalliance was mine, and I made the most of it, and I grew more and more conceited. Inevitably, of course, because of my great name, there were those dowagers and marriageable daughters who began to bait their traps for me. One evening, when I had laid on a splendid dinner at Canterville Chase to pay off some of my social obligations, a dinner at which my new French chef had given us pricket à champignon bordelais that melted in our mouths. A dowager duchess, much like that dreadful old dowager duchess of Bolton, an ancestress of hers, in fact, took it upon herself to remark archly, "How now, Sir Simon, is not 9 years a long while to stay without a helpmeet? And when shall we have a new Lady Canterville?" Now, dalliance was one thing, but marriage, as I had learned to my sorrow, was quite another. I was now 38 years of age, with a 16-year-old son, a 14-year-old daughter, so the succession was provided for, and I felt no pressing need for more daughters to have to worry about marrying off. I should have passed off the beldame's impertinence with a laugh, but instead I let pride in my borrowed plumes get away from me. Pride in my undeserved fame as a wife murderer, that is to say. Giving my head a waggle and allowing an enigmatic smile to twitch the corners of my mouth, I drew out the famous stiletto and delicately touched the tip of it with my finger. "Ah, yes," I murmured, playing my part shamelessly. "Who shall be next?" At that instant, a terrible flash of lightning and a clap of thunder filled and shook the room, and a great deep voice that only I could hear said, "All right, lad, you've had it." Voices from on high are timeless. They speak an idiom, past, present, or future, that suits them. The expression, which would only become current 4 centuries later, was unfamiliar, but its meaning was perfectly clear. Something cataclysmic had happened to me. I felt all fizzy, from head to toe, as though I were filled with that carbonated swill Americans guzzle so much of. One instant I had this fizzy feeling, and the next instant I was no longer on the premises, but floating around somewhere in space. Meanwhile, back at the Chase, a distinguished gathering of lords and ladies, as well as varlets and serving wenches, were picking themselves up off the floor and trying to decide what had happened. The only thing they could agree on was that their genial host, Sir Simon, was gone, vanished, disappeared suddenly, under very mysterious circumstances.